Hello, it's Amy. I thought I'd do a quick video here about Goethe's Elective Affinities. Now, I first gave Goethe a try a couple of years ago. I read his Sorrows of Young Werther because that's his most famous work, and that inspired, a whole host of poets. And people love it to this day, but The Sorrows of Young Werther was not for me. I hated that book. I didn't get it. It annoyed me. I was reading it and I kept thinking, that narrator just needed to get a grip and figure out his priorities in life instead of, ruining his life and making his whole life about love. But as I said, not for me. But I thought I would give Goethe a second chance with a different book of his. And so I took this along as train reading, and I really enjoyed it for about 2/3 to 3/4 of the book. I was probably just about here thinking, oh yeah, I've changed my mind about Goethe. Maybe Sorrows wasn't for me, but he's not a bad writer. He knows how to put a story together. And it was interesting because we have an introduction in this Penguin edition, and let me just remind myself, I think it was Hollingdale who did the, R.J. Hollingdale wrote the introduction for this book. And this is, this is a Penguin from the 70s. So he wrote the introduction for this edition published in the 70s. And he was saying, be aware it's this different form of a work. He refers to it as a novelette or a novella. This specific form of German writing, a way of structuring this German work of fiction. And he warned us as the reader that it might not be familiar as the traditional form of a novel that we're used to. But if I hadn't been told that, I wouldn't have thought anything of it, because it is structured very much in the format of the novels that I'm used to reading. I've read, a variety of novels from different eras, different decades, different cultures, different centuries. To me, it read like a novel. Yes, we may not get all the character development you would expect. Sometimes after we get some scenes, there's a little bit of a time jump and we're suddenly told the character felt this, the character did this. But that's fine because it flows quite well. For me, it was just when I got to the ending where I remembered how much Goethe likes these outlandish tragedies where everyone lets everything go to hell because they've been eaten up inside because of love, and they're unwilling to, step back from those things, or unable, maybe it's the same thing, unable to step back and realize that the course of action they're taking and letting their emotions rule over them isn't really the best thing for them. But I guess that's why so many people have been inspired by Goethe. There's people who love to take this idea of letting your emotions win to the extreme. But it's a very simple story. We have Edward and Charlotte. Let me just make sure Edward and Charlotte. Not the typical English spelling of Edward. In this case, it's Eduard. Edward and Charlotte, and they are living in perfect wedded bliss on their grand estate. They take up their times by they take up the time by landscaping, gardening, tree grafting. They have lots of servants, a big estate. They seem to be landed gentry of some sort. They've got villages and land and rental properties and a large income. They don't need to work at all. And so they're living this perfect life, this idealistic life. And because they're sort of still in this honeymoon period, they had a romance a few years before. They ended up marrying other people. Those relationships came to an end, I believe, through the death of their partners. Through the death of at least one partner, one of the others could have been either dead or divorced. But those relationships came to an end, and they were able to reunite and finally marry. Although it was Edward who had to propose many, many times before Charlotte finally gave in and married him. Although Charlotte is very much in love with him, but for reasons that are only partially explained, she has hesitation about whether they are truly a good match. And they're both very protective of their relationship. Charlotte has a daughter from her first marriage, as well as a ward that she refers to as her niece throughout. And her niece, Ottilie, I believe is the pronunciation of her name, is off at boarding school along with her daughter. Her daughter is a social butterfly, gets along well, excels in school. Ottilie does not. And Edward has a friend referred to as the captain throughout. The captain, who is down on his luck, has no place to stay really. And Edward proposes in the garden one day that his friend, the captain, come to stay with them. And Charlotte is extremely hesitant, and she warns him that she thinks the captain's presence is going to, break up their closeness and turn their wedded bliss into a threesome. And when two come together and a third is added, that usually breaks up that perfect couple. But he manages to convince her by saying, well, invite Ottilie back from boarding school, and that way you'll have Ottilie and I'll have the captain. And as you can foresee, this doesn't quite work out. Ottilie is 17 years old, 17 going on 18. And despite the age gap, Edward takes quite a liking to her and falls in love with her, whereas the captain falls in love with Charlotte. And there is this tension. And eventually Edward wants to marry Ottilie. But Charlotte is having none of it. She is still, despite having some attraction to the captain, she is devoted to her own marriage. And thus grows this tension between, this duty and this respect for married life versus this respect and desire for this love and this lust. And it turns into a whole big mess, which ends with people pining away and dying from lost love, which I have to say is something that I don't appreciate coming across all that much in older works of literature, and there's that either like unrequited love or unfulfilled love, and one party is so wrapped up in it that they cannot move on with their life, and they just allow it to absolutely eat them up inside until their health grows poorly and tragedy ensues. And there is a whole lot of tragedy in the end of Elective Affinities, to the point where I had the urge to, toss the book out the train window. I did not attempt any motions of the kind. But I did quite enjoy it because it is this mixture of, the storytelling narrative with some letters, with some very introspective foreshadowing passages. Like they have this one conversation between Edward and Charlotte and some friends who come to visit about how sometimes, two couples come together and they drive each other apart. And it's almost as though, a third party to this whole, love triangle, love quad mess is foreseeing and foretelling the events that are about to happen before they even happen. And then you have this local reverend who, he's kind of comical because they bring him in for some advice at the beginning. And he pretty much says, like, why are you asking my advice? You've already made your choice. I can tell you've made your decision. Give me a call when you're dealing with the aftermath, essentially. It's not as blunt as that, but essentially he's telling them that he's not one to give advice, but he will, counsel them on the aftermath of whatever decisions they make in life. And he does come to counsel them eventually on that aftermath. So in many ways, I enjoyed it up until a point, up until, as I said to my friend, up until it devolved, up until all the characters started devolving into these irrational messes. But I think the fact is that Goethe is just not going to be for me, and I know many people love Goethe. It's one of the same problems I find with a lot of the Emile Zola novels I've picked up. Things seem to really break down with the endings, where people start dying left and right and having these dramatic emotional endings. Not that things aren't emotional in real life, but in real life, things don't spiral out of control quite to this extent. Usually, I would hope. At least I've never seen it. But if you've ever read Elective Affinities, feel free to tell me I'm wrong. Feel free to share your own thoughts in the comments below. But I thought I would share mine. And that's all for today, so thanks very much.